The rope burned against Evangeline's wrists as she stumbled into the dusty main street of Copper Ridge, her torn calico dress barely clinging to her trembling frame. Behind her, the three men who dragged her from the stagecoach laughed like Hina as their leader, a scarred brute named Colt Maddox, already counting the silver coins he'd stolen from her meager purse. "Please," she gasped, falling to her knees on the sun-baked earth. "I'll do anything you want, just don't—" Well. Maddox's yellow teeth gleamed as he circled her like a vulture. "Anything you say?" The church bell chimed noon, and most decent folks had retreated indoors from the scorching August heat. Only a few curious faces peered from behind shuttered windows, too frightened to intervene. Evangeline closed her eyes, knowing what came next. She'd heard the stories. Young women who disappeared into the desert, never to be seen again. That's when the spurs rang out like silver chimes on stone. "Cut her loose." The voice was low, steady, and carried the kind of authority that made smart men step back. Evangeline's eyes snapped open to see a tall figure emerging from the shadows of the general store, his black hat pulled low over his face. The stranger's hand rested casually on the pearl handle of his Colt .45, and something in his posture made even Maddox hesitate. "This ain't your concern, stranger," Maddox snarled, but his voice had lost its swagger. "I'm making it my concern." The cowboy stepped fully into the sunlight, and Evangeline's breath caught. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30, with storm-gray eyes that seemed to see right through a person's soul. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a face that had seen violence but somehow retained an unexpected gentleness. "You know who I am." Maddox puffed out his chest. "I'm Colt Maddox. I run things from here to El Paso." "I know exactly who you are." The stranger's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "And I know what happens to men who hurt defenseless. Women in my town." His town? Evangeline's mind raced. She'd heard whispers about Copper Ridge's mysterious benefactor, a man who'd bought half the buildings and scared off the worst of the outlaws, but she'd never imagined he'd be so— Drifter Beaumont, Maddox breathed, and his face went pale, as parchment drifter. Even Evangeline had heard that name whispered in saloons and around campfires. They said he was faster than lightning and twice as deadly. Some claimed he'd once faced down 6 men in Dodge City and walked away without a scratch. Others swore he'd disappeared into the desert for 3 years and came back with eyes like winter storms. "Cut her loose." Drifter's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried across the street like thunder. Maddox's hand twitched toward his gun, then stopped. His 2 companions had already started backing away, recognizing the signs of a man who wouldn't hesitate to kill. After a long moment, Maddox pulled out his knife and sliced through the ropes binding Evangeline's wrists. "This ain't over, Beaumont," he growled, but he was already retreating toward his horse. "Yes, it is," Drifter replied simply. Something in his tone made Maddox mount up and ride out without another word, his men scrambling to follow. Evangeline remained kneeling in the dust, staring up at her unexpected savior with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. Drifter holstered his weapon and approached slowly, as if she were a spooked filly. When he reached her, he crouched down and gently helped her to her feet. His hands were calloused but surprisingly gentle, and she caught the scent of leather and sage. "You hurt, miss?" No. Thank you. I don't know how to— No need." He tipped his hat. "Name's Drifter Beaumont. Welcome to Copper Ridge." 3 weeks later, Evangeline Hartwell stood behind the counter of Copper Ridge's only mercantile, carefully arranging bolts of fabric that had arrived on the morning stage. The work was honest, the pay fair, and Mrs. Cornelia Fitch, the store's elderly owner, had been kinder than Evangeline had any right to expect. But every time the bell above the door chimed, her heart jumped, hoping to see a familiar black hat and storm-gray eyes. She'd barely spoken to Drifter Beaumont since that day in the street, catching only glimpses of him as he rode in and out of town. The other residents spoke of him with a mixture of reverence and wariness. grateful for his protection but puzzled by his reclusiveness. He bought the old Morrison ranch, Mrs. Fitch had explained one afternoon while they inventoried supplies. Lives out there alone mostly. Comes to town for supplies and to make sure the peace is kept. Good man, but she'd shaken her head. Haunted, that one. Got demons chasing him from somewhere. Now, as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, Evangeline found herself wondering what kind of demons could chase a man like Drifter Beaumont. She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice the approaching hoofbeats until the shadow fell across the doorway. Miss Hartwell, she spun around, nearly knocking over a display of ribbon. Drifter stood silhouetted against the doorframe, hat in hand, looking oddly uncertain for a man with such a fearsome reputation. Mr. Beaumont, she smoothed her apron nervously. What can I help you with today? Need some supplies. He stepped inside, and she noticed he favored his left leg slightly. Sugar, coffee, ammunition, the usual. As she gathered his items, she became acutely aware of his presence behind her, the quiet way he moved, the careful distance he maintained. When she turned to ask about tobacco, she found him studying a bolt of blue calico with an unreadable expression. Pretty color, she ventured. Reminds me of… He stopped himself, jaw tightening. Just the supplies, thanks. She totaled his purchase in silence, hyper-aware of the tension radiating from him. As she counted out his change, their fingers brushed, and she felt a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with the dry desert air. Miss Hartwell, he said suddenly, then paused as if struggling with the words. I was wondering if… would you… The bell chimed sharply, and Mayor Quincy Aldridge bustled in with his usual self-importance, completely oblivious to the moment he'd shattered. Beaumont, good to see you. Aldridge pumped Drifter's hand enthusiastically. Been meaning to talk to you about the Harvest Festival. We're planning quite a celebration, and I thought perhaps you'd like to contribute. I'll think about it. Drifter's voice had gone flat, professional. He tipped his hat to Evangeline. Good day, miss. He was gone before she could respond, leaving her staring at the door and wondering what he'd been about to ask. That evening, as she walked home to her small room above the dressmaker's shop, Evangeline noticed a package on her doorstep. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was 3 yards of the blue calico Drifter had been admiring, along with a note written in careful script, for a new dress. You deserve better than torn fabric. DB, she pressed the material to her chest, breathing in the faint scent of sage that seemed to cling to everything Drifter touched. Whatever demons were chasing him, she found herself wanting to help him face them, even if she had her own darkness to outrun. That night, she dreamed of storm-gray eyes and gentle hands, and woke with her heart racing and her body aching for something she'd never dared want before. The blue calico dress fit perfectly, hugging Evangeline's curves in all the right places while maintaining perfect modesty. She'd worked on it every evening for a week, stitching by candlelight and trying not to think about the man who'd gifted her the fabric. But as she walked to Sunday service in her new dress, she couldn't help but hope Drifter might notice. TQ. Small, whitewashed church was already half full when she arrived, families clustered together in their Sunday best. She'd just settled into a back pew when a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Through the open doors, they could see Jeremiah Pike, the town drunk, stumbling toward the church steps, with blood streaming from his nose. Behind him rode 5 men in dust-covered range clothes, their faces hard as granite. That's Maddox's crew, someone whispered. Evangeline's blood turned to ice. She recognized the leader immediately, not Maddox himself, but his lieutenant, a cruel-eyed man called Viper Crenshaw. He dismounted slowly, spurs jangling ominously in the sudden silence. Where's your protector? Now? Crenshaw called out, his voice carrying easily to every ear. Where's the great Drifter Beaumont when you need him? Reverend Murphy, a thin man with more courage than sense, stepped onto the church steps. This is the Lord's house, Mr. Crenshaw. I'll ask you to… Crenshaw backhanded him casually, sending the preacher sprawling. The Lord ain't here today, old man, and neither is Beaumont. Evangeline's hands clenched in her skirts. She knew why. They'd come, not for money or supplies, but for her. Word traveled fast in the territory, and Maddox wouldn't forget being humiliated in front of his own men. "We're looking for a particular woman," Crenshaw announced, his eyes scanning the faces in the doorway. "Pretty little thing with dark hair and green eyes. Goes by Evangeline Hartwell." The congregation's heads turned toward her as one, and she saw the fear in their eyes. These were good people, farmers, shopkeepers, families with children, but they were no match for armed outlaws. "I'm here," she said, standing on unsteady legs. Crenshaw smiled like a snake. "There she is. Come on. Down, darling. Boss wants to finish what we started." Evangeline walked down the aisle on trembling legs, past neighbors who averted their eyes in shame. When she reached the steps, Crenshaw grabbed her wrist in a grip that would leave bruises. "Please," she whispered, hating herself for the weakness, but desperate enough to try anything. "I have money saved, or I could make it worth your while to let these people be." Crenshaw's eyes lit up with ugly interest. "Oh, you could you? What exactly are you offering, sweet thing?" Heat flooded her cheeks, but she lifted her chin. "Whatever you want, just don't hurt anyone else." "Well, ain't that generous?" Crenshaw yanked her closer, his breath hot and rank against her face. "Maybe we'll take you up on that offer. Course might not be enough to save your friends here." That's when the church bell began to ring. Not the regular Sunday chime, but the rapid, urgent clanging that meant danger. Crenshaw frowned, loosening his grip slightly. And in that moment of distraction, a rifle shot cracked across the valley. One of Crenshaw's men toppled from his horse, clutching his shoulder. Then another shot, and another, each one precise and devastating. The remaining outlaws spun wildly, trying to locate the shooter, but the shots seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Ghost Rider!" one of them screamed. "It's the Ghost Rider!" Through the dust and chaos, Evangeline saw him, Drifter Beaumont astride a midnight black stallion, emerging from the desert like an avenging angel. His rifle spoke again, and Crenshaw released her with a curse, diving for cover behind a water trough. Drifter's horse thundered into the churchyard, and he vaulted from the saddle without breaking stride. His Colt appeared in his hand as if by magic, and suddenly Crenshaw was staring down its barrel. "You have 3 seconds to mount up and ride," Drifter said quietly. Crenshaw's hand hovered over his gun. "This is 5-1, Beaumont. You feeling lucky?" "I don't need luck." Drifter's gray eyes were winter cold. "I need you gone. 2 seconds." Something in his voice made even Crenshaw pause. The outlaw looked around at his wounded men, at the townspeople emerging from the church with newfound courage, and at the unwavering barrel of Drifter's Colt. "This ain't over," he snarled, but he was already backing toward his horse. "Yes, it is," Drifter replied, and this time his meaning was crystal clear. The outlaws rode hard for the horizon, leaving only dust and the metallic scent of fear behind. As the church bell finally fell silent, Drifter holstered his Colt and turned to Evangeline, his stern expression softening when he saw the bruises on her wrist. "You hurt?" She shook her head, though her whole body trembled like a leaf in a storm. "How did you know? You weren't supposed to be here today." "Old Pete. Saw them riding this way, came to find me." Drifter gently took her injured wrist in his hands, examining the purple marks with barely contained fury. "Should have killed them." "You saved us all," Reverend Murphy said, dabbing blood from his split lip. "The whole town owes you a debt." "No, it." Drifter's eyes never left Evangeline's face. "Just doing what needed doing." As the crowd began to disperse, chattering excitedly about their narrow escape, Drifter drew Evangeline aside. His hands remained on her shoulders, steady and warm. "They'll be back," he said quietly. "Maddox won't let this stand. Not twice." "I dunno." She looked down at her new dress, now dusty and torn at the hem. "I should leave, find somewhere else to go. I won't let innocent people suffer because of me." "Where would you go? You got family somewhere?" The question hit her like a physical blow. Family. If only he knew. "No," she whispered. no family, no home, nothing. Then you'll stay. Mr. Beaumont, Drifter. His thumb brushed across her cheek and she realized she was crying. And you'll stay because running won't solve anything. Maddox has a long reach and longer memory. The only way this ends is if he's stopped permanent-like. You can't face his whole gang alone. There must be 20 men riding with him. Something flickered in his gray eyes. Pain, or maybe old guilt. I've faced worse odds. That evening, Evangeline found herself sitting on the porch of Mrs. Fitch's boarding house, watching the sun paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The day's events felt like a dream or a nightmare, but the tenderness in her wrist reminded her it had been all too real. She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice the approaching footsteps until Drifter cleared his throat. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps, hat in hand, looking like a man wrestling with his conscience. Mind if I sit? She gestured to the empty chair beside her, acutely aware of how the fading light caught the silver threads in his dark hair. Up close, she could see new lines around his eyes, the weight of responsibility etched into his features. You don't have to do this, she said finally. Risk everything for me, I'm not worth it. His head snapped toward her, eyes blazing. Don't say that. Don't ever say that. It's true. You don't know anything about me, about what I've done. I know enough. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I know you'd sacrifice yourself to save strangers. I know you work hard and never complain. I know you've got more courage in your little finger than most men have in their whole bodies. You see what you want to see. Maybe. Or maybe you don't see yourself clear. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening horizon. I wasn't always in Copper Ridge, you know. Wasn't always the man trying to keep the peace. Something in his tone made her pulse quicken. What were you? The kind of man good people cross the street to avoid. His jaw tightened. The kind of man who solved problems with his gun and didn't much care who got hurt in the process. What changed you? A woman. The words came out rough, like they'd been torn from somewhere deep inside. Most beautiful creature I ever saw, with a laugh like silver bells and eyes the color of spring grass. She saw something in me worth saving, and fool that I was, I believed her. Evangeline's heart clenched with unexpected jealousy. What happened? To her, she died because of what I was, because of the enemies I'd made. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, shot down in the street like a rabid dog, all because she loved the wrong man. Drifter. Her name was Melody Carson. We were going to be married. He finally looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was devastating. I swore that day I'd never let anyone else pay for my sins. Swore I'd never care about anyone enough to put them in danger again. The confession hung between them like a bridge, fragile and dangerous, but there all the same. Evangeline reached out slowly, covering his scarred hand with her smaller one. Some promises are meant to be broken, she said softly. The attack came at dawn, just as Drifter had predicted. Evangeline woke to the sound of gunfire and breaking glass, her heart hammering against her ribs as she pressed herself against the wall of her tiny room. Through the window, she could see muzzle flashes lighting up the gray pre-dawn darkness like deadly fireflies. Beaumont, Maddox's voice roared across the town square. Come out and face me, you yellow dog, or watch this whole town burn. More shots closer now. Evangeline heard Mrs. Fitch crying somewhere below, and the sound galvanized her into action. She pulled on her clothes with shaking hands, her mind racing. Maddox had brought his entire gang. She could hear at least a dozen horses thundering through the streets, their riders whooping like Comanche warriors. A bullet shattered her window, spraying glass across the floor. She dropped to her knees, crawling toward the door as more shots peppered the building. Whatever Drifter's plan was, it wasn't working. She just reached the stairs when a familiar voice called out from the street below. Evangeline Hartwell. I know you're in there, darling. Come out and maybe some of these good folks won't have to die for your sins. Her sins. If only he knew how right he was. She crept to the broken window and peered out. The town was chaos, outlaws on horseback racing between buildings, setting fire to anything that would burn. She could see Mayor Aldridge cowering behind an overturned. Wagon, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. Where's your protector now? Maddox taunted. Drifter Beaumont, the great gunfighter. Turns out he's nothing but a coward when the odds ain't in his favor. That's when she saw him. Drifter emerged from the shadows between the bank and the saloon like a phantom, his twin Colts already in his hands. He moved with fluid grace, each step calculated and deadly. Two of Maddox's men saw him coming and tried to bring their rifles to bear, but Drifter was faster. His guns spoke in perfect unison, and both men toppled from their saddles. Here I am, Maddox. Drifter's voice carried clearly through the smoke and chaos. Just you and me, like it should be. But it wasn't just the two of them. Even as Drifter spoke, Evangeline saw 3 outlaws circling behind him, their weapons trained on his back. It was a trap, and he was walking right into it. She didn't think, couldn't afford to think. She grabbed the old buffalo rifle Mrs. Fitch kept behind the counter and ran for the back door. Her hands shook as she levered a cartridge into the chamber, muscle memory from her childhood on her father's farm guiding her movements. The first shot took out the man directly behind Drifter, her bullet catching him in the shoulder and spinning him from his horse. The second man turned toward her position just as she worked the lever again, and this time her aim was true. He dropped like a stone. The third man had Drifter dead to rights, his finger already tightening on the trigger. When Evangeline's final shot echoed across the square, the outlaw jerked backward, his shot going wild, and crashed to the ground in a cloud of dust. Drifter spun toward her hiding place, his gray eyes wide with shock and something that might have been admiration. But there was no time for explanations. Maddox was bearing down on him with murder in his eyes, and this time there would be no tricks or ambushes, just 2 men and their guns, with nothing but deadly skill to decide the outcome. You killed my brother, Maddox snarled, his Colt already clearing leather. Shot him down like a dog in Tombstone 3 years back. He drew on me first, Drifter replied, his own weapons steady in his hands. Same as you're doing now. Difference is, I ain't gonna miss. Neither am I. The 2 men faced each other across 20 yards of dusty street, the entire town holding its breath. Evangeline pressed the rifle to her shoulder, but she had no clear shot. The men were too close together, moving too fast. Time seemed suspended, stretched thin like taffy. Then Maddox's hand moved, faster than a striking snake, and the morning exploded in thunder and flame. When the smoke cleared, only 1 man was left standing. Drifter holstered his gun slowly, his movements careful and precise. At his feet, Maddox lay motionless, his sightless eyes staring up at the lightening sky. Around the square, the surviving outlaws were either dead or fleeing, their appetite for violence thoroughly satisfied. Evangeline dropped the rifle and ran to him, not caring who saw or what they thought. She threw her arms around his neck, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart against her chest. I thought I'd lost you, she whispered against his throat. Not that easy to kill, he murmured back, but she could feel the tremor in his hands as they settled around her. But waste, though that was closer than I'd like to admit. The shooting, Mayor Aldridge said, approaching cautiously with several other townspeople. Miss Hartwell, where did you learn to shoot like that? Evangeline stiffened in Drifter's arms. Here it was, the moment when her past finally caught up with her, when the truth came spilling out like blood from a wound. She began, then stopped. How could she explain? How could she tell these good people that before she was Evangeline Hartwell, seamstress and store clerk, she'd been Eva Sinclair, daughter of the most notorious outlaw in 3 territories? My father taught me, Evangeline said finally, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. Before he died. It wasn't entirely a lie, just not the whole truth. But Drifter's arms tightened around her, and she knew he heard the evasion in her voice. His gray eyes searched hers, full of questions she wasn't ready to answer. Well, thank the Lord for that, Mayor Aldridge said, mopping his brow with a blood-stained handkerchief. Saved Beaumont's life, you did, saved us all. The townspeople began to gather around them, their faces showing a mixture of relief, gratitude, and lingering fear. Mrs. Fitch pushed through the crowd, her motherly face streaked with tears. "Child, are you hurt?" "When I heard that shooting upstairs, I'm fine," Evangeline assured her, though she was anything but. The weight of her rifle still seemed to drag at her hands, and she could taste gunpowder on the morning air. "Just frightened." "Frightened," Doc Henley laughed, his medical bag clutched in one shaking hand. "Miss, you just outshot 3 men without batting an eye. That's not frightened. That's magnificent." But Evangeline barely heard the praise. All she could think about was the look in Drifter's eyes. Not accusation exactly, but a growing awareness that there was more to her story than she'd revealed. He was a man who'd lived by violence long enough to recognize it in others, and she'd just shown him a side of herself that no respectable woman should possess. As the crowd began to disperse and the business of cleaning up began, Drifter drew her aside. His touch was gentle, but his voice carried an undertone of steel. "We need to talk." She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "I know." An hour later, they sat on the porch of his ranch house, 5 miles outside of town. It was a simple building, sturdy and functional, with none of the decorative touches that marked a woman's influence. Evangeline perched on the edge of her chair like a bird ready to take flight, while Drifter leaned against the railing, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. "So," he said finally, "Evangeline Hartwell, that your real name?" Her throat felt like sandpaper. "Part of it. What's the other part?" She closed her eyes, summoning courage she wasn't sure she possessed. "Sinclair. My name is Evangeline Sinclair." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. When she finally opened, her eyes, Drifter was staring at her with a mixture of shock and something that might have been understanding. "Black Jack Sinclair's daughter," he said quietly. "You knew him?" "Knew of him. Every man who ever wore a gun in the territories knew of him." Drifter straightened slowly. "They said he robbed more banks than Jesse James and killed twice as many men. They also said he had a daughter who disappeared after he was gunned down in Silver Creek." "I was 17, Evangeline whispered. "He'd sent me to stay with my aunt in Denver while he pulled one last job. Said he was going to retire after that, buy us a little place somewhere peaceful." She laughed bitterly. "There was no aunt in Denver. There was no last job. There was just a penniless girl with a famous name and a price on her head. The bounty hunters found me 3 times. Each time I had to start over with a new name and a new story. I've been Eva Smith, Ella Sullivan, Annie Henderson." She looked down at her hands, calloused from honest work for the first time. Her life. Evangeline Hartwell was supposed to be the last one, the one who finally got to stay in one place and build a real life. Drifter was quiet for a long moment, processing her confession. When he finally spoke, his voice was surprisingly gentle. "Your father teach you to shoot like that?" "Among other things." She met his eyes defiantly. "I can crack a safe, pick a lock, track a man across 20 miles of desert, and put 6 shots in a playing card at 50 paces. I can also sew a straight seam, balance a ledger, and make biscuits. That would make you weep with joy. Which version of me do you want, Drifter? The outlaw's daughter or the shopkeeper?" "I want the woman who risked her life to save mine," he said simply. "The woman who'd offer herself to spare innocent people. The woman who's been running from her past for 8 years because she wants to be better than what she was born to." Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. "You don't understand. There are still bounty hunters looking for me. Still people who remember Black Jack Sinclair and want to collect the reward on his daughter. If they find out where I am, let them come." Drifter pushed away from the railing and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "I told you once that running won't solve anything. Same goes for hiding." "They'll kill you," she whispered. "Just like they killed—" She stopped herself. "But it was too late." "Like they killed Melody," he finished quietly. "I know the risks, Evangeline. But I also know something I didn't know 3 years ago." "What's that?" He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "Some things are worth fighting for, some people are worth dying for, and some promises His lips curved in the first genuine smile she'd ever seen from him. Some promises are worth breaking. Before she could respond, he was kissing her, soft and sweet and full of desperate hope. And for the first time in 8 years, Evangeline Sinclair stopped running. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning, with the desert painted in shades of gold and amber. Evangeline stood before the mirror in Mrs. Fitch's boarding house, adjusting the simple cream-colored dress she'd sewn from the finest silk the mercantile could order. Her hands trembled as she pinned her grandmother's cameo at her throat, the only thing of value she'd managed to keep from her old life. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Fitch said, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, "like an angel." Evangeline smiled, though her stomach churned with nervous energy. In the 6 weeks since Maddox's attack, life in Copper Ridge had settled into a peaceful rhythm. The townspeople had embraced her completely, grateful for her role in saving their community and charmed by her romance with their enigmatic protector. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this happiness was too good to last. "Are you sure about this?" she asked Mrs. Fitch, not for the first time. "About keeping my secret?" The older woman's expression grew stern. "Child, you saved this town, and everyone in it. Far as we're concerned, Evangeline Hartwell was born the day you stepped off that stagecoach. The past is the past." A knock at the door interrupted them, and Mayor Aldridge peered inside. "Begging your pardon, ladies, but there's someone here to see Miss Hartwell. Says it's important." Evangeline's blood turned to ice. "Who?" U.S. Marshal. "Name of Garrett Hawthorne." The room seemed to spin around her. Marshal Hawthorne, she knew that name. He'd been tracking her father for years before Blackjack's death, and he'd never given up the hunt for his missing daughter. Somehow, despite all her precautions, he'd found her. "Tell him I'll be right down," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Mrs. Fitch squeezed her hand. "Whatever happens, dear, remember, you're not alone anymore." Evangeline nodded and made her way downstairs, her wedding dress rustling around her ankles. In the parlor, she found a tall man with graying hair and a weathered face studying the photographs on the mantelpiece. He turned as she entered, and she saw recognition flicker in his pale blue eyes. "Miss Sinclair," he said quietly. "Or do you prefer Hartwell now?" "Either will do, Marshal Hawthorne." She lifted her chin, falling back on the dignity her father had drilled into her. "I assume you're here about the bounty." "Bounty's been withdrawn," he said, and her knees nearly buckled with relief. "Has been for 2 years now. Territorial governor issued a full pardon for any crimes committed by Blackjack Sinclair's family members, seeing as how you were a minor at the time, and never charged with anything specific." "Then why?" "Because I wanted to see for myself. What became of Jack's little girl?" Hawthorne's expression softened slightly. "I chased your father for the better part of a decade, Miss Sinclair. He was a hard man, no question, but he loved you something fierce. Used to talk about you every time we crossed paths. How smart you were. How he was going to make sure you had a better life than he did." Tears blurred her vision. "He's really gone?" 3 years now. Went down fighting in Silver Creek just like he would have wanted." Hawthorne paused. "He left something for you, been carrying it around, hoping I'd find you someday." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch. Inside was a simple gold locket and a folded piece of paper. Evangeline opened the locket with trembling fingers and found a tiny photograph of herself at age 10, gap-toothed and grinning beside a much younger Blackjack Sinclair. The letter was brief but written in her father's careful script. "My dearest, Eva, if you're reading this, then old Hawthorne finally tracked you down, and I'm probably..."